Hi, I'm Doug Seven, Senior Director at Microsoft Health Next. Welcome back to our video series on the Azure API for FHIR. In this video, we'll be looking at how to deploy the FHIR Server Sandbox into your Azure subscription. The FHIR Server Sandbox is an open source project we have in GitHub that enables you to deploy a simple environment that lets you explore and see how the API for FHIR works. Let's take a look at all the components. At the core of the Azure API for FHIR is something called the FHIR Server for Azure. If you go to github.com/Microsoft/FHIR-server, you'll find the FHIR Server for Azure project. FHIR Server for Azure is an open source implementation of the FHIR specification, and it is the core of the Azure API for FHIR. We simply take this open source project and run it as a first-party service in Azure. That means if you want to see how our service works, you can look at this open source project to better understand it. If you add a -samples to the end of the URL, you'll get the FHIR Server Samples project. This project is a simple deployment of a number of resources that give you the opportunity to explore how the Azure API for FHIR works. You'll see that there's two options for deployment. One uses the Azure API for FHIR in the center, and the other uses the FHIR Server for Azure as an open source project running on top of Cosmos DB. For this video, we'll be looking at the first example, which uses the Azure API for FHIR. Both deployments work essentially the same. It's just a matter of whether or not you get the managed Azure API for FHIR or the open source FHIR Server for Azure. As you look through the documentation in the project, you'll see there's a number of prerequisites for things that need to be configured or installed before you deploy this project. That includes cloning the project from GitHub so that you're ready to deploy it into your Azure subscription. There's 3 different scripting options for how you will deploy this project. The first option, you give it an environment name, and it says use PASS false, or use platform as a service as false. In other words, use infrastructure as a service and deploy the open source project. The next 2 have examples of how to deploy the project using the managed service Azure API for FHIR. In other words, use platform as a service is true. The third option is the same, but it adds an option for enable export true, which enables the bulk export capabilities of the Azure API for FHIR. We'll talk about that in a little bit. As you run this deployment, there's a number of resources that get put into your Azure subscription. You'll see an instance of the Azure API for FHIR, as well as 2 storage accounts, one for export and one for import. There'll be an Azure function to support the import of FHIR resources. By dropping JSON documents into the storage container, the Azure function will pick them up and ingest them right into the Azure API for FHIR. You'll also see a FHIR dashboard web application get deployed, as well as a Smart on FHIR application that we'll look at a little bit later. Once you've run the deployment scripts, you'll see a number of resources show up in your Azure subscription. Here you can see the FHIR-SAMP dev. FHIR-SAMP dev was the environment name that we provided. This is an instance of the Azure API for FHIR. There's an app service, which is that FHIR dashboard that we'll look at in just a little bit, as well as a number of other resources for analytics, for import and export, and some of these other capabilities. In the dashboard for the instance of the Azure API for FHIR, you can see a FHIR metadata endpoint. This is simply a link to the capability statement that's deployed with your Azure API for FHIR. The capability statement is defined by the FHIR specification, and it simply tells you what this instance of a FHIR server is capable of. You can see in this case that the resource type is a capability statement. It's an instance of the Microsoft FHIR server. And in this case, it uses FHIR version 4.0.1, which is the FHIR R4 release. And as you scroll down through the capability statement, you'll be able to see what resources are supported and what is capable with this FHIR server instance. Every FHIR server gets one of these. As we go back to the dashboard, we can also see that there's a FHIR-SAMP dev dash. So again, FHIR-SAMP dev was the name of our environment. Dash is appended to the environment name to be the web application dashboard. When you look at the app service in the portal, you can see a URL to the web application that we've deployed. In this case, it's a simple JavaScript application that accesses the Azure API for FHIR and returns a list of patients. You can see that there's a Patients tab at the top, which we're looking at. There's also an About Me tab, which if you click on will tell you information about your instance of the FHIR server, including the endpoint that it points to, as well as exposing your access token, which is of course not a best practice for production deployments, but for the purpose of a dev test sandbox, sometimes it's handy to have that information available to you. You can see here we're returning a list of 10 patients, and I can click on the arrow to see the next page of patients. We only have 11 patients total in this instance, which these are sample patients that are deployed into this instance for you. If I click on the Fire icon, I can see the actual Fire resource that was returned from the Azure API for Fire. In this case, I'm looking at a resource type of patient, and that patient has an ID. And that ID is unique within this instance of the Azure API for Fire. And I can scroll down and see the rest of that patient resource all the way down to some of the normal data you'd expect, including gender, birth date, and so on. If I click on the information icon for the patient, I get information about the patient as well as a set of conditions, encounters, and observations about that patient. I can click on the Fire icon next to any one of these resources if I want to see information about that resource. In this case, you'll see I'm looking at a condition, and that condition also has a unique identifier. That condition also refers back to a patient, which is the same identifier as the patient that we're looking at. So this is how all the Fire resources connect to one another. You'll also see at the top we have a designation for Smart on Fire apps. If I click on the Growth Chart button, a new tab will open up to log into the Fire dashboard, and we'll load the Smart on Fire application. As you can see, we're looking at the same patient, and we're looking at historical observation data of that patient. This is a standard out-of-the-box Smart on Fire application that we've configured to work with the Azure API for Fire. This is deployed as part of the sample sandbox that you're working with. As we go back to the dashboard, we can see some of the other resources that are deployed with this project. To look at a full list of the resources, you'll see everything deployed. One of the things you'll notice is a storage account that is appended with the word IMP.SA for import storage account. This is the storage account that enables you to drop Fire resources into it, and they'll automatically be picked up by the import function and ingested into the Fire server. So if you want to add more patient data to your Fire server for development and test purposes, you can drop them right into this storage account, and they'll be pulled into the Azure API for Fire. As we go back to the other resources in the subscription, you'll see that we've deployed a few other things. There's another storage account, Fire SAMP Dev Export. This is a storage account where if you use the export operation, this is where the Fire resources are deposited. So you run the export operation, and the output is ND.json files, and they're put into this storage account for you, as well as a few other things that are configured to support the different operations for what we're doing here, including a key vault and other app service plans. The most important parts of this are the Azure API for Fire, the sample dashboard, the export storage account, and the import storage account. So when you deploy the Fire sandbox, you get a number of resources deployed into your Azure subscription. This is not designed to be a production deployment. This is designed to be a dev test sample environment where you can explore how the Azure API for Fire works. You can look at some of the code we've written and how to use, for instance, a JavaScript application to access the Azure API for Fire and return data. You can see how we've configured the Azure API for Fire to work with Smart on Fire application, and you can explore other capabilities like the IoT connector and the ability to export data and de-identify, both of which we'll look at in upcoming videos. Thank you for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next video.